Hi everyone, welcome to my video today. My name is Spencer Nugent. I'm from sketchaday.com and today I'll be going over some simple shading techniques as it concerns cylindrical objects. Now I've got with me two color sets. I've got a green and orange. I'm using the yellow-green series and the yellow-red series, as well as a set of gray markers to create my shading and toning. Before we jump into rendering an actual cylinder, we need to talk a little bit about the mechanics of light and how that affects shading a cylindrical object. So here to my right, I'm sketching the side profile of a cylindrical object as denoted by the center line, as well as the end of that cylindrical object. Quick circle here. Now, if I'm observing from this position my cylinder, and let's say as I typically do, pick a singular simple light source to one side or another, just to simplify everything. What's going to happen is as my light rays pass the edge of this object here on the right side, I'm going to find that a shadow core, as it's called, will be developed. And on the opposite side, where these light rays are reflecting toward me in a concentrated area, as it pertains to the normals and the angles of reflection, I'm going to get a highlight and a shadow core on the opposite sides of the cylinder. So just to kind of flip things a little bit on the side view, what I have happening if my light source is coming from above, I have a shadow core toward the bottom and a highlighted area toward the top. Now what happens in the middle is I'll get a little bit of a blend as well as some ambient reflected light from the environment. Here at the bottom, we'll get our reflected light. At the top, we'll get a little bit of shadowing. And in the middle, as I mentioned, we'll be getting a little bit of a blend between the shadow core and the highlight, going from dark to light. Now let's take this principle and apply it to some quickly sketched out cylinders here. My first cylinder, I will be shading with a matte or dull finish. The second will have a shiny finish, and the last will have a gloss or highly reflective finish. Now, as a general rule, when I use my markers, I'm going to shade with my lightest color or tone and work toward my darkest color or tone. So here I have a series of cool grays, C3, C5, and C7. And to start, I'm taking my C3 marker and just outlining very lightly the area in which I'm going to apply my marker. I find that based on how I apply my marker, if I just block in the area, it creates a much cleaner drawing. Now you'll notice that I'm starting from the left side. You can start left to right, but I've skipped a portion of my marker application toward the left, which will be my highlight area. And I'm leaving this out because we are working on white paper with an opaque marker, so I need to be sensitive to areas that I want to keep lighter as I'm shading. On my second pass with the grays, I've hit that area with my 30% gray. And my goal here is to build up my shadow core, as you'll see, to the right side and blend from that shadow core left to right. You can see there I'm working in my blend so that I am creating that three-dimensional effect. Of course, the sketch itself has a three-dimensional feel to it because of the nature of the object that I've sketched, but the goal is to have the marker application reinforce the idea that this object is cylindrical. So now I've switched to my C5 to punch the contrast in my shadow core, and quite often I'll work back and forth between my two values, in this case my C3 and C5. And that way I can work in fine-tuning my gradient that I'm creating to communicate that this object is cylindrical. So now switching back to my C5, I can punch the contrast again in my shadow core. And then using my C3, blending back as I round. Again, to the right of the cylinder, I've left that area a little lighter, and that's because in the environment, I perhaps have some reflected light affecting the shade or tone of the object. So at this point, I'm going to take my C3 marker and continue to work my blend in and build contrast. Whenever you're trying to communicate a three-dimensional object in a two-dimensional medium like paper, it's important to have really good contrast. Contrast is really what's going to convince the viewer that your object is three-dimensional. On the top surface, I'm blending a little bit of C3 and C4 marker, and again setting up some contrast on that highlight side of my cylinder. It's a little counterintuitive, but setting up some contrast here so that it will appear as though that top surface is changing direction from the direction that my wrapped or round surface on the cylinder is in which it's oriented. So now that I've worked in my blend, I can apply some more darker tones, a C7 marker, followed by some blending with a C4 marker. And again, just paying attention to the contrast. With a matte cylinder, it's really important to have a nice even blend if possible. Now you may be wondering about the actual application of the marker. Why am I not going back and forth? I think with the nature of the object, I'm trying to build my gradient using as straight a lines as possible as they run vertically up and down the cylinder. And to the viewer, this will reinforce the idea in the mind that this is a cylindrical object. Pay attention to your surfaces and how they're oriented, and that will tell you a lot about the best way to apply the marker. Now with the shiny cylinder, again, I'm starting with my lightest tones, in this case a C3. However, there will be a couple things that are a little different. If you're ever curious about how to render or do something that you haven't done before, take a look at some reference, whether it's, in this case, a chrome pipe or something shiny. What you'll find happening is, rather than having a nice, even, smooth gradient from left to right, from my shadow core to my highlight, I'll still have a shadow core, as I'm showing here with my C5 marker. That shadow core is going to be a little tighter and crisper, if you will, as the surface becomes more shiny. And you'll see this really take effect with the glossy cylinder. And I'll still have a little bit of a gradient, and my highlight, will be a lot crisper as well. On the far left, I've added a dark line to suggest that perhaps in the environment, my shiny cylinder is picking up the reflection or compressed artifacting of an object. Again, if you're unfamiliar with how to do this shading technique with something that's shiny, take a look at something shiny and observe the objects in the room and how they are reflected into that surface. So this is my abstraction, if you will, of something in the environment being reflected into that shiny surface. Now it's important to communicate the surface quality and not capture everything and make a muddy rendering, if you will. So I'm working with approximations and abstractions as they touch on reality rather than trying to capture a compressed person or maybe a couch in the room or anything like that. So that's just my quick approximation of that phenomenon. Shiny cylinder is a lot quicker because we're not working with trying to create a nice even blend with our markers. One of the great things about Copic markers, however, is they do blend very well. So For the matte cylinder, although it took a little bit more time, the blending process was pretty painless because of how well the markers blend with each other. Again, contrast will help that object really read, so just punching that shadow core a little bit more with a C7 marker and adding some artifacting as well to show that indeed it is a shiny cylinder. And going back and forth, there's a C5 marker just to add a little bit more richness in that blend to show that it is kind of a shiny, stripy cylinder. So now we're going to start on our glossy cylinder, which will be a little bit different. And again, if you need to look at some reference to kind of see what I'm doing, go ahead, especially for you guys, if you go to the restroom, take a look at the chrome pipes there. What will happen is when the cylinder gets really glossy, the idea of a shadow core and highlight kind of falls apart a little bit. And instead what happens is the cylinder becomes a mirror. And this is kind of an abstraction or an approximation of what really happens. But what I'm going to try and do is apply a nice heavy contrast line right down the middle and blend away from that. And this is going to be simulating a horizon, if you will, or some strong element in the room that's being compressed along this line. And on the left side where the cylinder is being lit, we're going to have a nice wide highlight. However, away from this light to the left side we'll have a little bit of a gradation as well. And as I go through this you'll kind of see what I mean. So here's my very strong center line, and I'm going to use, in this case, a C8 and C7 and C5 marker and start to blend away from that, and maybe even pull in a nice C3 and C2 just to kind of blend away. Of course, if you have the Copic airbrush tool and air can, you could mask this area off and using your air can create the gradient pretty easily as well. But since we're using markers and we have a nice series, this is pretty doable. So you can kind of see here I'm setting up a nice contrast, heavy contrast line in the middle and gradiating away from that to create that effect that I mentioned. It's even helpful if you want to have a nice straight edge to help you crisp up that area. As you use a straight edge, however, especially if it's plastic, be very careful as you move it away because sometimes the ink will seep underneath that tool and ruin your drawing. So here on the opposite side, as I mentioned, where the object is being lit, we're going to have a very, very subtle gradient from left to right, and I'm using a C1 marker to create that gradient on the far side, as well as capturing perhaps a little bit of artifacting, okay, where I'm suggesting, okay, maybe there's a couple things in the room that are being really compressed and reflected into this object, this cylindrical object. And that'll just add to the realism of your rendering as you're rendering this glossy surface. So again on the top, I'm trying to add some contrast right in that highlight area because as surfaces change direction, we find contrast and that'll communicate three-dimensionality to a viewer. Okay, so what happens when you want to color or render an actual product, in this case a screwdriver of some sort? I've got with me a pencil, colored pencil. I'm using my yellow red series 4, 7, and 9, as well as my green series 3, 5, 7, and 9, and my grays that I've been using for the other cylinders. So much like the other cylinder, I need to decide on surface finishes and colors. And to do this, I'm going to outline areas in which a certain color will be applied. And this will help my marker just be a little bit neater as I shade from left to right. So much like the other cylinders, the first thing I'm going to do is identify my shadow core and highlight. So here's my shadow core, and I'm working with my lightest marker. So lightest light to darkest dark. And that way if I make any mistakes or I need to correct something, it's really easy since I'm working with a lighter color. So I've left out my highlight area for now. And depending on the surface finish, this may get filled in or be left completely white if it's meant to be a lot shinier. And you can see I'm leaving an area toward the bottom for my reflected light. And just a little ways up, punching my contrast, even with the yellow-green 03 marker. So I've gone ahead and colored in my highlight, which means I'm going to be working with a little bit more matte or flat finish to my surface and focusing on blending. So now I've moved up to my yellow-green 5 and using that to punch my shadow core and any other areas of shadow. And again, jumping back to my yellow-green 3 so that I can go ahead and start working on that blend. And again, with the Copic markers, you can see how well they really blend. It certainly helps to have the right paper. I'm using an alcohol marker paper right now, and in other words, it has a coating on the back so that my marker won't bleed through from front to my back surface. So quite often when blending, I'm jumping between markers or among markers. So I might jump from a 3 to a 5 to 7 to 9, back to the 3, then to the 7, and so forth, just to get that right blend. So now I'm punching my shadow core with the 9, jumping back to a 5 to work on that blend. And as you can see in the video, the paper is pretty saturated in that point and it's starting to dry back. While I'm working with my markers, quite often I'll squint my eyes, and this will help me see the true contrast of on the image that I'm working on. And it sounds really funny, but you could also get up out of your chair, take a few steps back, and look at your drawing. It's really easy to forget about contrast sometimes when I'm sitting and just staring at a drawing without squinting my eyes, taking a look at it. And squinting really just takes away the detail from the sketch so that you're then able to observe the contrast of the drawing. So much like the color, I'm outlining this portion with my lightest gray and setting up my blends. So again, depending on the finish, in this case another dull finish, and be focusing on creating the perfect or optimal blend, if you will, to communicate the quality of the material and the surface finish. So if you're just starting to do this, it might be handy to do a couple practice cylinders and even keep them handy so that when you are rendering a product, you can use them as reference to see where to put your highlights, shadow core, and so forth. So my shadow core I've built up with my C5, and I'm using my C3 at this point to help with the blending of that area. So applying the same principle and moving a little bit ahead in the video here, you can see that by placing emphasis on our shadow core and our highlight in the right areas, we're able to communicate form on this particular product. On areas where I'd like things to be a little bit shinier, I'm applying the technique that I used in the glossy cylinder. In this case it's horizontal, so at the top I've got my lighter gradient and I've got my very strong core running through the middle, nice and crisp. And again, this will communicate roundness, but also a change in surface finish. Building up a little bit more, you can see how that's starting to develop. I've got my C7 or C8 marker here, and punching that contrast in the middle really helps it communicate as a shinier surface finish while being cylindrical. A common convention with something that is very shiny or chromy is to place warm tones at the lower half of that cylindrical surface and cooler tones toward the top. It's a personal preference, but I prefer to keep things a little simpler and just stick to my cool markers rather than playing into that. Because if I were to do that, it would suggest that the screwdriver were in an outside environment, and to me, it's not. So at this stage of the drawing or rendering, I'm just taking a step back, looking at things, punching contrast, adding shadows where I need to, where there's any surface transition, part lines, things like that. The Copic sketch markers work particularly well for me here, where I can use the super brush tip and really dial in any contrasting areas that I need to dial in and punch. So remember, where there is a change in surface direction, even in this small area on this little bump out for the power button, I am punching the contrast between the side and front facing surface so that it does feel like a three-dimensional object. And working with my grays again to correct or punch any contrasting areas that need to be punched or corrected. And already you can see, even if you were to squint your eyes and look at this video, you can see how I'm trying to work and manipulate those contrasting areas. So on a typical sketch like this, for me, I like to come back and add a little pencil line to the outside just to kind of define and crisp things up so that there is a boundary or limit to things. Sometimes I use pencil, sometimes I use pen. In this case, I grabbed what was closest to me, which happened to be a pencil. But a pen would work just fine as well. And certainly using something like a ruler to crisp up areas that need a little extra help. No harm done there. Keep some pressure on the tip of that pencil so that you're not making your line too wavy with the tip slipping under as it did for me. But no biggie, that can be cleaned up pretty easily. So by using a nice black pencil and punching that contrast just a little bit right at the boundary there, again pushing and emphasizing that this surface is glossy or shiny. So hopefully you can see that, especially if you do take a minute, squint your eyes, look at the video, and see where and how I'm building contrast through this object. And should start to seem pretty three-dimensional. So still just working with my pencil here to emphasize contrast where necessary as well. But one of the cool things you can do with marker is just stipple a little bit where, in this case, I want to communicate a little, perhaps more matte surface. I can reinforce the message by adding a couple texture dots to show that this is a little rubbery or textured surface. Okay, and I'm concentrating my texture by placing the dots closer together near my shadow core. And toward the top, I'm going to add some dots as well using my C4 marker. The dots toward the bottom are created using my C7 or C6 marker, and that way they blend into the shading and actually show through as a texture. So just working on my core again here and my blending through the middle with my C5 marker, and switch to a C4 just to continue that blending process. Okay, so when I'm finished, quote unquote, finished with a section, I'm not done until I'm entirely happy with that section. But again, just squint, look at the drawing, and you'll see how that contrast is helping it read like a three-dimensional object. Okay, well, thanks for taking the time to watch this video. Hopefully it's been somewhat informative about communicating surfaces, especially cylindrical surfaces, using Copic markers. And using the blending to your advantage to show contrast and form. If you would like to see more of my work, be sure to visit www.sketch-a-day.com or visit me at facebook.com/sketchaday or instagram.com/sketchaday, DOTCOM. Thanks again, and hopefully you've been able to get something out of this. Now get up and go draw something. Thanks.